Hey everyone, Wolf Lord Rho here. Today we're discussing Alpharius' reflections on his brothers. Spoiler warning to begin, as the events we're discussing today are from the Horus Heresy Primarch Series novel, Alpharius Head of the Hydra, by author Mike Brooks. As always, I really recommend you read the stories for yourself first, as that's the best way to enjoy the lore for yourself, without spoilers. But with that said, let's just jump straight in. Now, over the years of the Heresy series, we've got to know all the Primarchs to one degree or another. For some, we've been blessed with many scenes of them with their brothers, such as with Horus, Sanguinius, Magnus or Rogel. For some, we've been lucky enough to see them interacting with their father, such as Vulcan and Corax for example. And then there's those few Primarchs who have remained a little more elusive than their kin, with us maybe not getting blessed with quite as many in-depth moments with their brothers or father. And for me, it feels like Alpharius is most definitely on that list. But then came his Primarch series installment, Head of the Hydra. Originally as the final found Primarch, there could be reasoning that Alpharius simply didn't have time to truly get to know and forge stronger bonds with his fellow Primarchs. However, Head of the Hydra certainly presents an alternative to that, with Alpharius revealing he was actually the first found instead, crash landing upon Terra, remaining in secret to watch and observe until all his other brothers were found. And while I have doubts over some of the events and reasonings of Alpharius' tale, there could and is equally stories of truth therein. The enigmatic mystery of the Alpha Legion at its best. And undoubtedly the best insight throughout its story for me is glimpsing Alpharius' thoughts and reflections on his brothers. And there's one moment that stood out for me most of all. A moment where, in rereading the story over the past couple of days, I really wanted to focus on this aspect again. A moment where he's rationalizing his subterfuge and lies amongst his brothers by comparing it to their poor relationships anyway. And it's extremely interesting to see Alpharius' opinion on this, the areas in which I agree and disagree with him. And he began with Leman Russ. Russ doesn't like any of his brothers much. I would list his particular dislikes, but I think that's still about half of us. When you consider he's fought duels against both Angron and the Lion, and had to be talked down by Lorgar from going for Magnus's throat, well, you get an idea of his temperament. Now, for a Primarch who devotes and prides himself on observing his brothers, I'm incredibly surprised by that first line, that Russ doesn't like any of his brothers much. One of the best developments of the Heresy series for me, as a true son of Russ, has been seeing the greater depth that the character of Leman Russ possesses. How the stereotypical barbarian king was in truth a mask, a shield that Russ presented to the rest of the world, including his brothers. Yes, he was of Fenris, he became of Fenris, but he was far more calculated and reasoned behind that Wolf King appearance. And that applied to every aspect of his life, including that of his brothers. Russ kept his Primarch brothers at arm's length to fulfill his duty as the Emperor's executioner, on the instruction of his father, as implied by the novel Wolf King. For me, I'm very surprised one such as Alpharius, if indeed he was supposed to be secretly around since Russ's very reunion, has bought into Russ's charade quite so much. There's a moment earlier in the story where Russ and Alpharius are talking, and Alpharius is skeptical that Russ is actually as drunk as he appears. And it's interesting he doesn't appear to take that notion further, to be able to see further past that Wolf King bluster. Russ doesn't hate any of his brothers. In fact, I've often perceived Russ to feel a responsibility for most of them, almost an elder brother type responsibility. His reason for dueling Angron was not out of hatred, but instead a desire to help his brother open his eyes, to try and make him see sense. Even with Magnus, by far his worst sibling relationship, he appealed to him privately before the Battle of Prospero, to make him not do this, to end it all peacefully without the need for bloodshed. That is the true Russ within, the one who sought to teach and help Angron, who appealed to Magnus, who stopped to laugh against the lion, who didn't kill Horus and instead appealed to his first united brother. Russ knows the role he must perform for his father. He knows the extremes of it. Far from not like most of his brothers, as the actions suggest, I think we've seen the truth beneath revealed now enough to say the reality is quite different. Alpharius then moves on to the Lion and Lorgar, who he claims both believe they are better than their brothers. Only in Lorgar's case it's out of love for their father, instead of the Lion's feelings of martial capability. Now for this one, I'd say he's spot on with that one in the Lion. L. Johnson does have an undoubted belief in his own superiority. He felt he was the best one to be War Master. He prides himself on being the first. In a pantheon of arrogance that is the Primarchs, the Lion really does take some beating. It's one of the reasons I'm a little nervous if he ever does return, how his character may change, because I absolutely love the arrogant, no-nonsense superior belief that is Lion L. Johnson. I don't ever want him to change. Now applying that to Lorgar, however, I'm not so sure. Yes, he was a bit OTT with his worship of their father, but I've never really felt him come off as feeling superior because of it. In fact, I'd say quite the opposite. Lorgar seemed to love being one of the Primarchs before it started to sour. Yes, like all the Primarchs, he would complain about his brothers, but his affection was clear, on more than one occasion. And even once in the heresy, he seemed to continue to truly care for his brothers still. In one of Horus's first councils with the traitor Primarchs, Lorgar completely halted the meeting, sensing Fulgrim was not who he appeared to be, demanding to know where his true brother was. Of course, feelings of superiority don't mean a lack of affection. However, I just have to disagree with Alpharius here. The Lion, yes, but Lorgar? No, not for me. Alpharius then continues to sum up several more of his brothers. Perturabo hates Rogel, and Rogel barely likes him any better. Few truly trust the Khan. Mortarion is Dourness incarnate, and most of my brothers pity Angron, consider him positively dangerous, or both. I'm not sure I could disagree with any of those descriptions. The Perturabo-Rogel rivalry is obviously legendary, though it would have been nice to get Alpharius's perspective on them and their personalities in particular. particularly with Perturabo. Jagatai, despite being my second most loved Primarch, was absolutely not trusted by most of his brothers. Although in saying that, maybe trust is a little extreme. I don't think anyone would have had an issue working a campaign with the White Scars. I think it was more they simply didn't know Jagatai. They couldn't predict him. And well, that was his whole purpose in the end. So maybe that is a little harsh from Alpharius. Mortarion dourness, I mean come on, even Mortarion can't argue that one. And most of the brothers pitying or writing Angron off as dangerous. Again, a tragic but fairly straightforward assessment. That was very much the way the Primarchs viewed Angron. Really, what other option was there? The Butcher's Nails had removed the Primarch he was supposed to be. And if we're honest, the Emperor didn't exactly help matters either. The Emperor we see finding Angron couldn't be any more different than the one who finds Corax, for example. But I guess that's an interesting comparison on how they each view their father. Corax had a clear love, Angron had a clear hatred. Now next, Alpharius brushes Ferrus and Fulgrim off as arrogant, that none of them like Conrad Kurz, and revealing Guilliman has a tendency to put the hackles of others up, due to his belief that not only has he solved the problems of warfare, but that he can write it down while he does. Ferrus and Fulgrim being brushed off as arrogant is, even for a Gorgon fan like me, pretty accurate. Fulgrim's arrogance is legendary, and from everything we've seen of Ferrus, he had a pretty big chip on his shoulder in that regard too. Now for Conrad, however, I think Alpharius is largely right. He was generally disliked by his brothers, but I would have loved to see a little more in-depth on Kurz from Alpharius' view here. While personality-wise they are extremely different, I dunno, I just feel Alpharius could have been intrigued on the similarities in the ways of war. Yes, there are clear differences there, but I also just feel some similarities too. I would have seen Alpharius being particularly intrigued by Conrad's way of conducting war. I think Kurz is another one of those Primarchs you have to look beyond the surface with, and I'm surprised we didn't get that with Alpharius here. He seems to have taken Russ and now Conrad on that surface value. Guilliman putting the hackles of his brother up, a fun and probably pretty accurate description, I think we can all agree. We know Guilliman enjoyed a pretty good relationship with some of his brothers, Rogol, Corax and Sanguinius, a few off the top of my head. But it's undoubted his manner and ideology grated on some too. He pretty famously had a strong mutual dislike with Alpharius too. So Alpharius viewing Guilliman in this way shouldn't be a surprise. There was probably a lot of comments and eye rolls about Guilliman when Alpharius discussed him with other brothers. So Alpharius would have only had that point of view reconfirmed in those conversations. Again, it's that statesman duty-esque part of Guilliman's character he simply could never turn off. Finally, Alpharius ends with stating Magnus is too immersed in sorcery. No one can really form an opinion on Corax, that he keeps himself to himself, and that Vulcan and Sanguinius carry echoes of their father's nobility, particularly Sanguinius. And lastly, that Horus is of course the brightest of them all. Now, Sanguinius being painted with the nobility brush is nothing new. He is the very paragon of the Emperor's nobility, the symbol of the Imperium, and the dichotomy of the savage, rad-blasted world he called home. But seeing Vulcan's name in there, now that is a little surprising. In a way, it's an interesting revelation to how Alpharius must view the Lord of Drakes, clearly holding him in good esteem. Considering Vulcan's warm nature, it's hard to think of any of the brothers not particularly liking him. But still, it's not often you hear his name termed with nobility. I suppose when you think about it, Vulcan absolutely is noble. He does share the Emperor's nobility. To have his humanity is to be noble, to be virtuous. And there's none that represent that more than Vulcan. However, it's very rare to get other Primarchs' faults on the Lord of Drakes. For all his visibility in the Heresy series, it's not often we get others' faults on him. We're usually getting his faults on his brothers. So getting this piece of observation by Alpharius is nice to see, especially when you couldn't have two more different Primarchs alike in nature. Alpharius very much intentionally cold and aloof, whereas Vulcan about as warm and welcoming as you can get. All in all, I'd say I concur with most of Alpharius's opinions. You can't say any are wrong, because they are his opinions. But I do personally view some differently. Russ and Lorgar were two I was quite surprised by. I thought Alpharius may be more inclined to see beneath the Wolf King's mask, and I struggle to see Lorgar as coming off with feelings of superiority. It would have been nice to get a little more in depth from Alpharius's point of view on some certain brothers, such as Conrad, as I said. However, equally so, it was good to be able to infer brothers he does hold in high regard, such as Vulcan, which is one I would have never necessarily thought about before. For me, I think maybe Alpharius's unique bond and connection with Omegon maybe affects the way in which he views and interprets the actions of his other brothers. That because he has such an instinctual connection with Omegon, being able to understand each other's feelings and actions without the need for words, that maybe this is why he struggles to see past the Wolf King's mask, that he can't see beyond the outside of Conrad Kurz. And I think that could be something to consider for a later date. Does the relationship between the twins affect how they perceive their other brothers? Do they take things on face value that maybe they shouldn't? Did it perhaps have an effect on his actions during the fateful encounter with Rogel? As always everyone, what do you think? Are you surprised by how Alpharius views some of his brothers? Do you agree with all of his perceptions? Are you surprised by how he views some of his brothers? And like me, are you beginning to think his relationship with Omegon could maybe have had a profound effect on his relationships with the other brothers? As always, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Huge thank you to all my subscribers, your support truly means a lot to me, it really does. If you're new, please consider subscribing to help the channel grow. And if you enjoyed this particular vid, then why not drop a like on it too? But with that said, I am off, and I'll see you all again real soon.